This year.
Okay, I'll start when you're in your seats. Your eyes up here. Go up fast. Okay, wait on you guys.
What was the protein simulation?
The one where you had to draw that blue alien with 4 legs and freckles that was hairy.
Okay.
And it's on your Schoology. You just go under materials where it says assignments. If you go to the calendar, you look at the date in which we did it, and click on that assignment as well. I have no idea. Probably somebody took it already. Yeah, you can't have it fast and you can't leave. No. Okay, when it's quiet, I'll start. I'm waiting on you guys. This is me up here waiting for you guys. Alright, so we talked a little bit about the... Okay, we talked a little bit about some of the individuals that helped lead to Darwin's evolutionary theory. Who was the first to talk about evolution, right? We talked about Erasmus Darwin, his grandpa. We talked about Buffon, we talked about Lamarck, we talked about Carl Linnaeus, who came up with the classification system. So those guys are important. They'll be on the online quiz. So look out for the online quiz. It will be posted probably tomorrow, the next day, and due sometime next week. Now, in order for the theory of evolution and his theory of natural selection, which is the process in which species change over time, in order for it to make any sense and to be plausible, we have to establish something that at that time, not a lot of people believed. And that was very simply that the Earth is old. It's not just 6,000 years old, it's really, really old. And not only that it's old, it's that it's been changing. So the idea that God created on the 7th day Earth exactly as you see it today, and then He perfectly designed all the animals, right? I don't know if that was the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th day, I don't know what was going on with that in Genesis, right? And then He placed them exactly in those environments in which He created, perfectly fit to that. That idea, right, goes counter to the fact that the Earth is super old and it's been changing. So if it's always changing and organisms are shaped to their environment, then they must either change, they must have a mechanism to change as well. And so some of the individuals that proposed that theory that was going against the modern belief was the geologist by the name of James Hutton. James Hutton proposed not only that the Earth was old, but that it slowly changed over time, and that theory was called gradualism, because it gradually or slowly changed over time. Just a couple years ago, we found this piece of zircon, right? This piece of rock that was dated to be 4.4 billion years old. So how old's the Earth?
60 billion years.
So we got 6 billion, we got 8 billion, 16 billion, that's the age of the universe.
65 billion.
26, 14 billion. All right, so right now I just did a little checking for understanding. I just surveyed your prior knowledge as to the age of the Earth, right? And George, it is
4 billion?
It's a, yeah, well, if this rock that was found is 4.4 billion, and the planet Earth is only 4 billion years old, then that's interesting, right? Does it have to be older or younger than this rock?
Older!
Younger.
I can't find a rock that's 5 billion years old, or 4 billion years old, in a planet that's only 2 billion years old. That would be a really good unless it fell or landed from an asteroid that was 4 billion years old.
4 billion years old.
Thank you for dropping some knowledge into the conversation. Correct answer is 4.6 billion years old. So this is a really, really, really old rock in terms of the age of the Earth. How do we know how old rocks are? We use something called radioactive dating. This picture is not in your notes. Radioactive dating, without getting into all the chemistry of it, works a little something like this. Who wants to raise their hand and tell me, oh, my kingdom for somebody who can recall from the beginning of the year the word isotope? stop. Maybe whisper to your neighbor. Tell me what an isotope is, Moreno.
When there are two numbers from a mass number, like the atomic number and the mass number, the difference between two, that are sort of the same.
You're in the right realm, but subtracting the atomic number and the atomic mass just gives you the number of something, right? Gives you the number of neutrons. But we're in the right realm. Yeah, Lily.
It's when you add what's it called?
You're right there.
You add neutrons.
Neutrons. We have too many neutrons in the nucleus, making the atom heavier than it normally is. So if we looked at 100% of all the iron, 100% of all the carbon, 100% or gathered all the atoms that are in the planet Earth of a specific atom, a small percentage of them are going to be isotopes. So if I look at a rock that's made up of a bunch of different atoms, a small percentage of those atoms are going to be the isotope form of those atoms, right? And that's a known percentage. Now, those isotopes have what's called a half-life. And a half-life, for those of you who play the video game, is the amount of time that that isotope takes to break its nucleus down into half, turning itself into a different isotope. You see, radioactive isotopes are very unstable. They're heavy, so they're giving off their matter, their nucleus, in the form of radioactive energy. So, and we have calculated specific atoms have a very specific half-life. Carbon has a very short half-life of a couple thousand years, so we can only really use carbon to date things within thousands of years old. But other isotopes, which are much heavier and much larger, we can use those atoms and the rocks that are made up of those atoms that have those isotopes in them to date back to hundreds of millions of years old. So the way that we do that is if a brand new rock should have 100% of those isotopes in their full form. They have not broken down yet. If we look after one half-life cycle, right, then half of those atoms have been converted into a different isotope. Okay? And then a different isotope. And then a different isotope, right? And we just go from one half, and then what's one half, one fourth. What's one half, one fourth, one eighth. And so we look at the rock that we find today, we see the percentage of the isotopes that there are versus the parent isotopes, and we can calculate the age of that rock. So if I find a rock that's 138 million years old, and there's a fossil in that rock, guess how old that fossil is? 138 million, give or take, right? So James Hutton, okay, so James Hutton right here, James Hutton was the one that presented gradualism. Guys, if I find a fossil at the bottom of this rock, and I find a fossil above it, which one is older, the one on the bottom or the one on the top? So these rocks are formed by layers. This is called sedimentary rocks. And the farther up you go, the younger or the more recent that fossil is. And so we see that the changes of these rock patterns have been happening for long periods of time. Darwin was friends with Charles Lyell, a good friend of his. One of the people that convinced him, dude, you got to write your book. Alfred Wallace, look at this article. I mean, he's right at the toes. He's about to clinch your glory. He came up with this theory. Go back and write your book. Okay, Charles Lyell was a geologist. He studied the earth. He did not study biology, he studied the earth. And he was a friend of Darwin's, and he wrote a book called The Principles of Geology, saying that if volcanoes are erupting today, changing the environment, then that must have been happening for long periods of time. Right? This concept is called uniformitism. And he also stated that the earth was really, really old. So these guys in their books greatly influenced the way that Darwin thought, because it's necessary for the earth to be old in order for evolution to occur. And so let's talk a little bit about, from the video, Darwin's journey. Now, he went to what islands?
Galapagos.
Did Wallace go to the Galapagos? No, where did he go?
Africa.
No. Off the coast of Australia, in between Australia and Asia, in an island. The what? Yeah, the Malaysian Islands, the Malay Archipelago, right here, where you see Borneo and New Guinea, okay? All of these islands where Indonesia is, that's where he traveled, okay? And he saw similar things that Darwin saw in the Galapagos. Now, Darwin was on this boat for 5 years, but he only spent 5 weeks on the Galapagos Islands. There was something about the islands that really struck a chord with Darwin, and he came with a lot of his conclusions. I showed you this already, right?
No.
This, who said this is not funny? This is hilarious. This is freaking hilarious. Who doesn't get this joke? Lucas, seriously?
Dude, I just see turtles.
The Galapagos, the 100-yard dash,
Yeah.
day 3.
Because
Because I'm laughing so, first of all, it's the 18th time that I've seen this.
I get it.
So when the hair
You don't get it? What does it mean?
Doing sprints with
What does it
I
mean?
know, Eve, thank
Mr.
you.
Vieira.
I get it.
You don't know funny.
It gets 3 days to run 100 yards through turtles.
Wow.
That's hilarious.
That's
Mr. Vieira, does the hair still use the ring?
There's no hair in this.
You don't get the joke, that's even funnier.
Does the hair still use the right?
I could say something silly, but I don't want to.
Like the hair that
Yes. Oh, the hair's sleeping at the front of this. He got ate by a lizard. I don't know.
you
That's the path that he took. Started in England, went all the way around South America, stopped there for 5 weeks. Went around here, New Zealand, wop, 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 back, down, around, back up.
That is
Long time, 5 years.
That's funny.
All right, but he didn't just, when he landed there, he didn't just look at one type of species, look at lots of different types of species. And one of the ones that pointed out, if you remember the video, they said that the Spaniards could look at the tortoises, and from looking at their shells, they could tell you which island they were from. Right? If they had this kind of medium-length neck and their shell was shaped like this, they were from the Pinta Island. That was way up here, of this archipelago, this group of islands. If they had this kind of shortened neck, they had this stone. But if they were kind of thug-like and they sagged their shells, right? If they had a red shell or a blue shell. You know what I'm talking about. I can be funny.
I know you are.
If there's graffiti on their shells, they may look a little bit like this. Now, let me ask you. Which of the turtles do you think in their island had to eat from bushes a little bit taller than they were? Where do you think the main food source was for the turtles in Islam?
On the
What do you need? What do you need? Okay, go back. I'll help you with it. You didn't just look at. We're gonna be doing an activity. You guys are gonna be doing an activity about the beaks, the Darwin's finches. Be looking at data of these beaks. So he measured the beaks of these finches. What he noticed about the beaks was that they were different. There was like 14 different species of Darwin's finches. They call them mockingbirds in the video. But they all looked very similar, but not exactly, of one type of bird that was on the mainland of Ecuador. So the idea that he thought was that there was this common ancestor, much like from those platygrams, that flew over from the mainland and spread out throughout the islands. And each individual island having its own habitat caused each population to evolve in its own direction, creating these different species. So from one species, an ancestral species, spawned many different species. This concept that Darwin created was called adaptive radiation. And so if you look at them, there were some that ate insects and lived in, some that lived in trees, some that lived on the grounds, some that lived in cactuses, right? Some, cacti, thank you, say cactuses, cacti. And if you looked at where they lived and what they ate, their beaks were very different. The ones that live in places where they primarily ate seeds had very thick beaks. The ones that ate insect had these kind of grasping-like beaks that could easily grasp and snatch onto insects. The ones that ate the fruit of specific plants had almost like a parrot-like beak, so on and so forth. So their beaks were very specific to what types of food they ate. Sorry, here are these ones right over here are the ones that ate seeds. So here's some of the drawings that he had in his own notebook of some of the finches that I saw. Which one do you think ate seeds?
The one.
Yeah, number one. Number one. Think of it like those like the nutcrackers that break open the shells of a walnut. So we need the strength. And in times of drought, what we notice when the seeds are a little bit harder, you'll see even over a course of a couple generations, the beaks will even get thicker before your own very eyes. It's not something that takes a million years to happen, and it can happen very quickly. Other things that Darwin observed that led to his theory of natural selection were the fossils. Remember from the video, he found a fossil of what organism that he was eating at the time?
Fish. Was it fish?
An armadillo.
Oh.
He found a fossil that belonged to the shell of a giant, ancient armadillo-like creature that was no longer existing. It had gone extinct. And he found it near a place where you found living armadillos that are currently alive. And so this idea that the fossils look similar and are found in similar places of organisms that resemble them shows this link of common ancestry. So the Earth must obviously be very old to support these fossils. And we see that these organisms and fossils have changed gradually over time. The fossil record is not complete. A lot of people argue against the fossil record. It's like telling me the plot of a 3-hour movie by looking at 3 5-second clips. Now, you might not be able to get the entire plot, but you'll get somewhat of an idea. But the more and more fossils that we find, the more and more of those clips that we can fill in and get a better understanding of the plot of that movie. Yeah.
When was the theory of Pangea?
So 250 million years ago, right,
Yeah.
is when the continents, I mean, if you just reverse track the distance in which they're going out of continental drift, you can see how they kind of fit together. But also, here's some evidence. They find fossils of large terrestrial organisms in the west coast of Africa. They find similar fossils on the east coast of South America. You see this? Of like large, terrestrial land, not birds, but big, large walking animals. They'll find the same types. So if you take these two puzzle pieces and you connect them together, and you see that they are at one point joined, that's where these organisms were. So they had died, their fossils had been fossilized, and since then, these continents had drifted apart. So that's another evidence to not only support continental drift or Pangea, but the idea of fossils being very old. So I'm going to show you a couple video clips, a little bit of artificial selection. You are going to be tested on artificial selection. You will need to know what it is, what examples of artificial selection are, and how and why, what was the significance of artificial selection in Darwin putting it in his book as evidence or proof that his theory was true, or that it had validity. Anybody want to tell me what artificial selection means based on what you can read from the notes? That's right. Who wants to tell me? Does anybody have an idea what another name for this that's commonly used is selective breeding? Yeah.
Like horses.
Horses. That's an example. Any other example where
Dogs.
humans choose dogs? Anything else where humans choose which has sex with which? Cats.
The donkey and the
No.
Yeah, the hybrid. Well, that is selective breeding. You don't see donkeys and horses randomly having natural sex out in the wild. What else? Is it only animals?
No. What?
Is it only animals that we selectively breed? Huh? Flowers. Every single crop that has ever been planted by a farmer since the beginning of agriculture, thousands and thousands of years ago. Corn was created from an ancient crop called teosinte that Native Americans had selectively bred to look like the maize and the corn that we eat today. Broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kale. There's lots of things. Hey, what's up, guys?
Hi.
All of these. Hey. How you doing?
Hi.
Darwin used two examples because it was prevalent at his time. He used horses. Horses that were that were for horse racing. If you look at a horse that's meant for horse racing in England, and you look at the natural kind of wild horses, or the ones that, if you look back at the fossils of horses where they derive from, they look nothing like what we see today in like horse bred for horse races. But he also looked at pigeons. He looked at the ancestor of the first ancient common ancestor of pigeons, where we had these pigeon breeders that would breed pigeons. And it was almost like it was a hobby. And they would have all these different types of pigeons that could come, some with really colorful feathers, some with little things dangling off their beak. I mean, we created all these different types of pigeons from this common ancestral pigeon. But I think, like we said before, one of the most obvious forms of artificial selection that man stepped in was dogs. Now, where's the natural habitat for the poodle, guys? Where do they naturally?
My house.
France, right there. Hey, I get that area. Well, see, poodles came from Paris, right?
No, they came from Beverly Hills.
where the breed
No,
originated.
those are chihuahuas. Hey,
Where are the Chihuahuas? Where are the Chihuahuas' natural habitat?
Beverly Hills.
Beverly Hills, some people say Mexico. Now,
That's why they went to Mexico.
okay guys, there is no natural habitat for any dog breed. You don't see poodles frolicking through the streets of Paris, hunting for mice, and then taking them back to their natural den. You don't see Chihuahuas amongst the cacti and blue agave in the plains of Mexico. Yeah, dogs. You don't see like Chihuahuas living in the wild, evolving into other types of Chihuahuas.
I mean, Lucas frolics around the
Oh, let's shoot
house.
on Lucas. I'm not even gonna shoot on her.
Darwin stated this, and I'll show you a video in a second, so calm down. If mankind can create this much diversity from a wolf, because that's world dogs, one wolf. Do you guys want to step outside?
No.
I'd love for you to step outside. Let me finish this.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, well then shut your mouth. Thank you. Awesome. Now, if we can create all the different breeds of dogs that you see, if man can do it, then why can't nature? So what he was saying is that the same principles that we do here, specifically breeding only those traits that we want, creating all this diversity, well, what if nature picks who breeds? By killing off those that don't have favorable traits and letting those that do have favorable traits breed. And so that's the link between artificial and natural selection. But it's not just dogs, right? I mean, the ancient mustard seed, a wild mustard plant, is the plant in which we have selectively bred to create kale and broccoli and Brussels sprouts and cabbage and cauliflower. And these are the parts of the flower that we specifically picked that trait. And if it was a little larger and a little greener, we just planted those seeds. And we only crossed these flowers, not these over here, because I don't like what the traits that we have here. And we selected and selected, and generation after generation after generation, we went from this to these. And so that's the stuff that you see in the supermarket. Artificially selected foods that have been bred over many, many, many generations. What? Yeah.
Darwin and Wallace both realized that the same principles of selection that have so dramatically changed both plants and animals under domestication should also act in nature. So while plants and animals vary in all directions, the differences are inherited. Many more individuals are produced than can possibly survive and reproduce, so that creates a competitive situation. Favorable variance will